Dear Marie-Laure, I write to you, an art historian in 2005, with a proposition from a possible future. My understanding is that you are attending a conference where concepts of global art beyond a magicien effect will be debated, and I thought that historical revisioning could also be discussed. I send this letter from the future so that you can inform the other representative. The exhibition in 1989, called Magiciens de la Terre, never occurred. Even if it happened, it is forgotten. Perhaps some may find this proposition odd, thinking that the organizers of a seminal event like Magiciens are due a higher honor than to be neglected by historians. But that is not my intention. I am only interested in equivalence, and as we all know, those whose views dominate in the art world often write their own histories, and in the process they erase ideas and events that others hold dear. What is this supposed magicien effect in reference to? Is it about the historiography of curating? Is it about the marketing of artists? What about the history of art made regardless of curatorial fashions or expanding markets? Is it about major institutions in the West taking an interest in art outside the West? Is it about gratitude? In the future, those of us working from what used to be called a periphery are setting aside the discourse of gratitude. Instead, our shared starting point is that we are mapping and theorizing the various entanglements of coeval cultures as expressed, addressed, or rejected by contemporary artists. This is being approached in at least three ways. First, we are interested in linkages among aesthetic and social movements. From this perspective, there was no depoliticization of the critical art of the 60s, 70s, and 80s by the benevolent paternalism of Magiciens de la Terre. We instead trace a connection from feminism, black consciousness, anti-colonial, and anti-Cold War movements, from fluxus and situationism, from multiculturalism onto Documenta 11, and to the aestheticization of popular resistance in the early 21st century. Second, we have documented centers of art outside of Europe, beginning in the early 20th century, where local effects of modernity were engaged, and we recall the rise of art, both neo-traditional forms and formal art schools. First in colonial context, and then with increasing intensity in the early post-World War II and post-colonial eras of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. 3. We note important exhibitions, including those held outside of major Western centers, which displayed non-canonical work well before 1989. In retrospect, the idea that 1989 was a watershed, or that these other shows were not landmarks, that they do not count, was only a result of not having been counted in the first place. It is possible to recall the important moments in the global history of contemporary art during the late 20th century and early 21st centuries, even both before and since 1989, without Magiciens in the picture. Since they also happened in your own reality, perhaps it is only the trajectory of attributed significance in history that has been confused in the time and place you find yourselves in 2015. I think it is sometimes good to collect that which is commonly known into one place, lest we forget the obvious. So allow me quickly to review some familiar landmarks. In the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was a post-war rise of the international, intermedia, anti-establishment performance scene, stressing events over objects, fluxus, happening, gutai, situationism, and so on. There were multiple art centers and schools established in Africa and elsewhere in the global south. Ernest Mankoba worked with the Cobra Group, and Gérard Sekoto exhibited at the Tate. The Sao Paulo Biennial was founded. The first World Festival of Black Arts was organized in Senegal in 1966, and the Pan-African Cultural Festival took place in Algiers in July 1969. These events promoted ideas from leading intellectuals, artists, and political activists, which had their roots in earlier 20th century movements of Pan-Africanism and negritude, and each had attendance figures in the thousands. Also, in 1969, contemporary African art at the Camden Arts Centres in London exhibited the work of Dumile, Uzo Egonu, Ibrahim El Salahi, Iba Ndiaye, Uche Okeke, Gérard Sekoto, and Twins 77, among others. The 70s saw the launch of the Valparaiso Chile Biennial and the Black and African Festival of Arts and Culture in Lagos. From 76 to 96, David Elliott, as director of the Museum of Modern Art, Oxford, pioneered exhibitions of art from Latin America, Asia, South Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union, later moving to Stockholm and then Tokyo. In West Berlin, the first Festival of World Culture, Horizons 79, included 800 artists from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Horizons was the first major exhibition to expose the art of Congolese painter Thierry Samba on the international stage. In 1978, the journal Black Phoenix was founded by Rashida Rin in London, evolving into Third Text, a hotbed of global art criticism. In the 80s, the UK Black Arts Movement built on the model set by the Black Arts Movement in the US in the 60s. In 1988, Autograph, the Association of Black Photographers, was established in Britain by Rotimi Fani Kayode and others. 1984 saw the first Havana Biennial, known to this day for its focus on South-South artist relations and its sustained response to global and local political imperatives. Worthy of special notice is the Tributaries exhibition, curated in South Africa in 1985 by Ricky Burnett and traveled to BMWI Art Gallery, Munich in 1986. In the future, we acknowledge it as game changer from the South, an early example of the exhibition strategy where contemporary gallery artists were shown alongside outsider artists. As I write to you today, I recall that 2015 was the year we celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Tributaries exhibition, with retrospective exhibits and conferences debating the way forward. At Tributaries, the whole range of art creation by all groups in South Africa was exhibited under one roof: modernists, craft artists, traditional and visionary artists. This approach only became fashionable in international curating over the next 2 decades. A number of Ndebele artists were shown before their success as so-called self-taught or ethnic modernists after 1989. The context was the relevance of contemporaneity, a radical gesture at the time. This was followed in 1988 by the neglected tradition at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, a more historically minded show that charted the Black experience in South Africa and described social and historical connections between rural and urban and informal selling and gallery showing artists. Also, in 1985, the diaspora concept was explored in the American Experience, Contemporary Immigrant Artists, which toured in the US and included Armand, Skunder Bogossian, Christo, Komar and Melamid, and Nam June Paik. This art as diaspora angle became common in art world discourse by the late 90s, for instance, in Valerie Cassel's Chicago show, Cry of My Birth, and the traveling show, Looking Both Ways, Art of the Contemporary African Diaspora in 2003. 1987 saw the inauguration of the Istanbul Biennial, one of many global extravaganzas that expanded the contemporary scene, especially from the 90s onward. In the future, we recall that the space opened by discourses on identity in the 60s, 70s, and 80s led to the greater inclusion of artists of color, of diaspora people, and of artists from the global south who did not only make identity art, nor were they necessarily so-called self-taught visionaries. A milestone in this history was The Other Story, Afro-Asian artist in post-war Britain, curated by Rashid Arin at the Hayward Gallery, London in 1989. The Other Story examines the historical relationship between modernism and African, Caribbean, and Asian artists in the UK. It showed how modernism and postmodernism within Europe was already entangled in other histories, including the significance and presence of non-Western artists within the West. Our common understanding today is, as Jane Fisher writes, that cross-cultural encounters are perceived as central to the formation of modernism. This approach informed mainstream discourses on contemporary art into the 90s and beyond. For example, the new museum's Decade Show, 7 Stories about Modern Art in Africa, The Short Century, Africa Remix, and Documenta 11. The establishment of Revue Noire in 91 and NKI in 96, the show Africa Explores in 92, and countless smaller exhibits and publications in the 90s and 2000s that built upon or referenced those foundations. Even if we agree with the late 80s and the early 90s were pivotal years in the arts and in the politics, still our emphasis differs on where the shifts occurred and to whom credit should be given. For us, the objects of art and the works of display are relevant across a wider global field. My expertise is African art history, but one could make a similar list of critical events from elsewhere in the global south, or Eastern Europe, or even from the perspective of non-hegemonic cultures within each locale. I should add, in the future, Africa is not a place where objects or people of a certain type are produced, because in the future, each person's culture will be defined by where it has traveled to. In the future, artists' nationalities are listed according to the countries where they have exhibited and not where they were born. In the future, Africa is no longer imagined as Europe's past, but there are Africas in its future. The future vision I give you is about how we write our past. In the future, modernism is understood to have been a cultural complex in heterogeneous reaction to the condition of modernity, of industrialization, the spread of global capital, and the imperial colonial context that sustained it, but whose effects in and time-space differed according to location. In this future, words like tame, inauthentic, and derivative that were once used by metropolitan critics to describe moderns from elsewhere are now used equally to describe, for instance, Picasso or Richard Long, or spaces of international curator emanating from Europe, as seen from Africa or Australia or etc. And if we were forced to admit its existence, then I would say that Magiciens muted a pointed politics of difference already current in the international art world since at least the 60s. a politics that was already crossing boundaries in and out of the West. It ignored the fraught history of aesthetic engagement with and within modernism outside the West, including important exhibitions of the very same artists it claimed to have discovered. Instead, it created a spectacle of wonder and diversity of the world's creatives. At the end of the 80s, and at the end of the Cold War, this was a step backward. It was a gesture of hospitality where none was needed. And that is why, in the future, we are ungrateful and we forget about it. The future promises an era beyond vague parochial gestures towards some universal, where we well know how the complexity of particularism and cultural entanglements have underwritten the global contemporary art scene. In the future, we have already done better. I hope you can share this good news. Yours sincerely, John Peffer.